AITA for leaving the room after my BF surprised me. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Brad had been working tirelessly for months, and I thought he finally wanted to treat us to some much-needed relaxation at his family's cabin in the woods, just the two of us. I should have felt lucky, but as the sun dipped below the horizon on our first night, I sensed something was off. After a lovely dinner, Brad insisted we take a stroll outside to gaze at the stars, a romantic gesture, I thought, but when we reached the clearing, he pulled out a flashlight and shone it onto a crudely carved face on a tree. "Isn't that creepy?" He laughed, but I just felt a chill run down my spine. It looked like a distorted version of a human face, its mouth stretched wide in an unnatural grin. I jokingly told him it reminded me of a horror movie, but Brad's laughter faded into something more serious as he pointed out the countless other carvings littering the trees around us, each one more sinister than the last. It felt like we had stumbled into the hideout of a deranged artist. I suggested we head back, my instincts screaming at me that this was not just a scenic getaway but perhaps something else entirely, yet he insisted on taking a closer look, thrill-seeking gleaming in his eyes as he veered deeper into the woods, and I followed reluctantly, the growing darkness around us feeling more oppressive with each step. That's when I stumbled upon an old makeshift altar tucked away behind the trees, adorned with a grotesque collection of animal bones and what looked like dried flowers, and I froze, dread coiling in my stomach as a realization dawned upon me that this wasn't just an innocent surprise. Brad's sense of adventure had led us into something dark and ancient, perhaps a ritual of some sort that beckoned us into its fold. When I nervously voiced my unease, Brad just chuckled and insisted it was all just part of the fun. In his mind, it was another wacky challenge to conquer. That night was a canvas waiting for our adventures to color it, but I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching us, a presence that made my skin crawl, and when I looked back to him, I no longer recognized my boyfriend. The glint in his eyes was wild, as if the forest itself had wrapped him in its cruel grasp. I turned to leave, my heart pounding, but he laughed again, telling me I was being dramatic, and pulled my arm, the grip tightening until I yanked away, the laughter fading to an intensity that made my blood run cold. It hit me then that the woods weren't just alive, but they had a heartbeat and it wasn't friendly. "This isn't funny, Brad." I almost screamed as panic bubbled in my chest, but he could barely contain himself, entwining a lock of my hair around his fingers, looking past me as if I were an obstacle blocking him from the greater thrill lurking in the shadows. The air thickened, charged with a tension I couldn't shake and screaming at me to run, but for some reason, I didn't. I felt like I was watching my own life play out in front of me, a puppet on strings I couldn't control. Brad leaned in, whispering something I could no longer hear, his breath brushing against my neck in a way that sent electric shivers down my spine, and then it happened. Behind him, from the darkness, emerged something human-shaped, its limbs crooked and elongated, lurking with a predatory stillness as if it were mimicking the worst parts of humanity. Its gaze locked onto me, pinning me in place, and I fought with every fiber of my being not to scream. It was a body, I realized, a sick parody of a human form, its skin taut and pale as if stretched over too many bones, and I could almost see it smile, formed not from joy but something more sinister, something avid and hungry. I stumbled backward, my survival instincts kicking in, and without a second thought, I bolted back toward the cabin, half glancing over my shoulder to witness the horror unfold as Brad turned, his look of excitement morphing into confusion, then anger as he called out after me, a distorted echo against the trees. I flung myself into the cabin, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in rhythm from my panic as I frantically locked it, breathing heavy as I sank to the floor, the oppressive quiet of the retreating woods wrapping around me. But it didn't take long before I could hear him pounding on the door, his voice shifting to an angry holler as he demanded I let him in, that I was overreacting, that it was all just part of the surprise. I wanted to scream back, to explain that something had changed in him, that whatever he had become was a stranger, but the dread pulled deeper, shoving all logic aside as I crouched between the couch and a coffee table, praying the darkness would hold me tight. The house felt like a coffin, the night seeped through the walls, mocking my isolation as I reached for my phone, just wanting to call someone, anyone, but when I turned it on, it was dead, an unexpected betrayal that froze the blood in my veins. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear, and the silence that loomed outside felt thicker, a presence lingering just out of sight, and when I finally mustered the courage to peer through the window, my breath caught in my throat. Brad stood looking towards me, uncharacteristically still, shadowed by the trees, but in that moment, the woods seemed to breathe with him, the upside-down grin plastered on his face wider than before. I realized then that whatever he had confronted out there, whatever darkness he had engaged with, had seeped into his very essence, reshaping him into something unrecognizable, and all at once, fear surged. He would come back to the door, but it wouldn't be Brad. I felt it deep in my bones that I had wandered into something that wouldn't allow me to leave easily. My heart raced as shadows danced behind him, flashes of twisted figures lurking in the moonlight, and time seemed to lose sense as the night wore on, every call and pound on the door drowning in an abyss that threatened to devour me whole, and I knew then that the hardest choice lay before me, to wait in agonizing uncertainty or to escape while I still could, but the truth gnawed at me. The person I fell in love with might already be gone, replaced by a reflection of an ancient ritual's hunger, festering beneath the guise I once trusted. Ultimately, I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my bag and slipped out through the back, terrified but driven by the primal instinct to survive, running into the woods with my heart racing, the weight of the foreboding night chasing me as I looked back just once, only to see Brad, the distorted figure in the darkness, staring back, the woods swelling around him, wrapping him in their embrace, and in that haunting moment, I knew I wasn't just running from him, I was escaping an entity that had taken his place, a dark truth that clung to me like an omen, whispering that if I ever looked back, I might join him, too. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that left me questioning my sanity and ultimately led me to this moment of confession. My cousin Jamie is 7, and he is, without a doubt, the most insufferable little monster I've ever encountered. From tantrums that could wake the dead to the way he crafts intricate lies just to see how far he can push the adults in his life, it's a miracle that he hasn't driven my poor aunt to the brink of madness. When my aunt asked me to babysit him for the weekend while she took on extra shifts at her job, a request that came with the guilt trip about how much she needed the money, I felt the flood of irritation rise within me. It wasn't just the idea of babysitting Jamie that made my skin crawl, it was the knowledge that he would spend the day trying to find creative ways to torture my patience. I remember the last time I babysat him, he told my aunt I had locked him in the bathroom for hours when I only stepped out to grab my phone from the kitchen, and she believed him without questioning a single word. Heart-pounding, the memory of his sweet, innocent smiling face as he recounted that fabricated tale to her on the phone replayed in my mind, and I snapped, "AITA for refusing." I had meant to gently decline, but my frustration erupted, and I told her I couldn't babysit a lying Brad and that Jamie didn't deserve my help. The silence on the line spoke more than 100 words, and I could almost hear her heart shatter through the phone. I hung up, instantly filled with regret and the gnawing dread of what my refusal might mean for her job. Uncharacteristically, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, but I convinced myself that it was for my own sanity. That night, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in my gut, as if I'd unknowingly invoked an ancient curse. It wasn't until the night of my refusal, just as I struggled to fall asleep, that I flicked off my lamp and was met with a whisper that slithered through the shadows of the room, the distinct sound of a child's laughter merging with the eerie creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I turned to face the darkened corner where the shadows projected odd shapes, and I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. Yet, when I shut my eyes again, I could still hear it, his laughter, soft and sinister. Over the next few nights, the laughter grew louder and more distorted, as if taunting me for my past refusal, and I began experiencing vivid nightmares of Jamie lurking just outside my bedroom door, a twisted grin stitched across his face, his eyes glimmering with malice that should have never existed in a child. These weren't ordinary nightmares but vivid reenactments of every terrible thing he had done to me, the time he convinced me to jump into a freezing pool so he could watch me flail, or when he deliberately spilled soda all over my homework and feigned ignorance. He was attempting to break through in some dark, demonic way. I started doubting my reality. Was Jamie truly a lying brat, or was there a different, more sinister entity taking control of him? The whole week passed in a haze, each night marked by a new scream echoing in my mind, and each day drained me further. My aunt was clearly worried. She texted me not only to reassure me about Jamie but promised she wouldn't leave him with me ever again. Still, every time I thought of Jamie, I saw the flicker of something dreadful behind his eyes, almost a hunger for chaos that made my heart flutter with dread. And just as I began entertaining the idea of going to my aunt to apologize, a storm rolled in, pounding against my windows like a frantic child desperate for attention, forcing me to confront my refusal once and for all. 4 nights in, I was yanked from a thick slumber by the sound of footsteps in my living room and a familiar cackle that sent icy dread pooling in my stomach. Tired, shaky, and on edge, I crept down the hallway, my heart thumping hard enough to overlay the sounds of thunder. As I rounded the corner, clutching my phone like a fast-acting spell against whatever overlap between dream and reality awaited me, I came face to face with Jamie, grinning, his small figure silhouetted by moonlight spilling through my window. Except this time, there was something off about him, a deep shadow hanging over his form, almost tethering him to the floor as if gravity itself hungered to keep him from escaping my view. "Can I come in?" His voice was sweet, yet sinister, a perfect harmony of the innocent tone wrapped around the darkness that slipped through the walls like smoke. I blinked, unsure how to respond, frozen in the threshold of my own home. Was this truly my cousin, or had the shadows taken his form? "Let me in," he urged again, the sweetness giving way to a disturbing insistence, and as I stood there, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was paralyzed as we locked eyes, and if I hadn't summoned the will to yank the door shut, someone, would have slipped inside. After that encounter, I very nearly convinced myself I was losing my grip on reality, my mind betraying me, robbing me of the line between imagination and truth. But every scream of laughter echoing through the dark only bolstered my conviction that I had come face to face with something wicked. Days turned into a blur of anxiety as I huddled away from the world, each corner I turned feeling haunted by the shadow of laughter that taunted me from just beyond reach. When I heard a faint knock at the door days later, I felt my blood run cold, and for once, I thought of checking to see who would be foolish enough to knock after everything, but the creeping dread rooted me in place. Then, a faint giggle burst through, and I knew it was Jamie. Memories of my aunt pleading with me to forgive him flashed, but deep down, I understood my refusal echoed through to this day, and I prayed the darkness would answer since I didn't dare look up at the door. Instead of opening up, I chose to remain haunted by the shadow of that constant laughter, and in a twisted reality I had only begun to comprehend, I waited, driven out of necessity to understand that some monsters are very real and don't exist merely in stories. I chose to ignore that knock, hoping to bury my guilt in silence, but what would I do now when, no matter where I turned, the sound of Jamie's laughter remained a reminder of the child I once knew who now belonged to the dark? I never considered myself a bad friend, but the day I snapped at Jenna, my pregnant best friend, turned my life upside down. It started innocently enough. Jenna was over for the 4th time that week, her foot swollen like a cantaloupe, her back aching from all the weight she was carrying, and to be fair, the complaints were unending. Each time she plopped down on the couch, it was like an exorcism of woes, the nausea, the cravings that went unfulfilled, and her desperate need for a foot rub. I could empathize. Pregnancy was undoubtedly hard, but each session felt like I was hearing the same horror story on repeat. By the time she showed up on that fateful Friday evening, I was exhausted from a week of late shifts and even later coffee. As she sank into her supportive pillows, I braced myself for another round of grievances, and that's when it happened. "I just want one day where I don't feel like a beached whale," she lamented, and something inside me snapped. It wasn't even the comment itself, but the way her eyes glazed over as she spoke, like she was on autopilot, repeating the same verses in a never-ending song of misery. I'd had it. I turned to her, feeling my chest tightening with frustration, and said, "Jenna, I can't stand your complaining anymore. You're pregnant, yes, but you have to find joy in this somewhere, right? I get that it's hard, but damn it, other people have it worse than you." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The laughter we had shared moments before died, her smile fading into a tight line, and silence enveloped the room like a cold blanket. I thought she'd laugh it off or throw a pillow at me, but instead, she just stared. Her reaction was haunting, her disappointment scalding, and for the first time, I sensed a dark shadow looming over our friendship. She muttered something that got lost in the tension before getting up and leaving, the sound of the door clicking shut echoing like a gunshot. At first, guilt gnawed at me. Had I been heartless? But then came ask you comfort, a whisper in my ear that maybe my words held some truth. The next day, a part of me expected her to text, to berate me or demand an apology, but nothing came. Days turned into a week, and I could feel the silence stretching like a taut string, almost ready to snap. When I did reach out, she'd answer but with the stiffness of a stranger. What hurt most were the glimpses of social media. I could see her struggles, the photos of swelling feet, cradling hands, but none of it felt real anymore. It was like watching a staged production where I had been written out of existence. Part of me felt relieved, thinking this space would allow her to regroup, but deep down, dread nagged at my core. Then, on a particularly lonely evening, just as I was about to drown myself in Netflix and Ben and Jerry's, a text from her lit my screen. "Can we talk?" My pulse quickened, I felt sick but also exhilarated. I agreed and mentally prepared for the storm. She arrived, and I noted the weariness etched on her face, shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," she started, voice wavering. "About what you said." Panic prickled my spine, but she continued. "I've tried to conceal my struggle because everyone tells me I should be joyful, I should be glowing, but I'm not. I'm drowning, and I thought you, of all people, would understand." I opened my mouth to apologize, realizing she wasn't just pleading for sympathy, but begging for a lifeline. I could see it now, all of it, the internal battle she fought, the guilt of not experiencing the serene bliss of motherhood while others sang its praises. But as I awkwardly fumbled with my words, it was clear all that came out was a mix of trembling apologies and half-hearted reassurances. I wanted to lift her burden, but the weight was too much for both of us, and just when I felt like we might connect, she dropped a bomb. "I had a dream about you, you know. Last night." Darkness washed over her expression, twisting reality into something grotesque, and my heart sank as she recounted a visceral dream of a shadow that had pulled her into a hall of crooked mirrors, and there, in every reflection, I stood, grinning, unfeeling, as she writhed beneath the surface. My skin prickled. "It felt so real, Jen. Like you were watching me suffer, and you didn't care." The moonlight pooled through her window as her voice softened. "You became the thing that haunted me." I tried to explain how I was just worn out too, but looked into her eyes and froze. I saw desperation, yes, but lurking beneath was something darker, something that felt like loss more than just disappointment. Then I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a weight in the air that made my breath catch. Something was coming. The power flickered then dimmed, leaving us awash in darkness, and I glanced around, heart racing as I felt it, a presence at the edge of the room, chilling and heavy, wrapping itself around our fears. "Jenna," I whispered, panic creeping back into my voice, but before I could even turn back to her, I felt an icy grip on my wrist. The last thing I saw before the shadows overwhelmed us was Jenna's eyes, wide and terrified, no longer filled with sorrow but pure dread, as she mouthed a word, "Help." It was in that moment, amidst a palpable darkness, I realized that my inadvertent cruelty had unleashed something far more menacing than either of us could comprehend, and as the darkness closed in, I understood, we weren't just fighting between us, we were wrestling with the very horrors we had conjured, each complaint, each thought twisting into the shadows waiting to consume us whole. When my in-laws announced their planned visit, I had mixed feelings. Their last visit had left me exhausted, and their habit of criticizing my parenting and my home loomed large in my mind, so I decided to child-proof our house even more than usual. It felt necessary, not just for my peace but also for the safety of my 3-year-old daughter, Ava, who could turn any mundane object into a weapon of chaos. I began with the basics, outlet covers, strapping the heavy bookshelf to the wall, and locking away any potentially harmful items. But as I rummaged through the cabinets for anything that might hand my in-laws an excuse to criticize, I stumbled upon an old shoebox filled with knickknacks from my childhood. Inside, I found an ornate porcelain figurine that my mother had insisted on keeping in the living room, a delicate ballet dancer with a lifted dress and pointed toes, fragile yet hauntingly beautiful. A chill ran down my spine at the thought of Ava breaking at the moment Grandma laid eyes on it. So, I tucked it away in the attic, convinced it was the responsible thing to do. In the weeks that followed, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. Every corner, every shelf was scrutinized. I installed more baby gates than I could count and even placed breathable netting over our balcony railing. It was excessive, but I wanted to avoid the shame of an "I told you so" from my in-laws, should the worst happen. The night before their arrival, I barely slept. My mind raced, plagued by visions of what might go wrong, a splinter, a bruise, or worse, an injury. When the morning came, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. As I sat in anxious silence with Ava, the doorbell rang. The moment my in-laws stepped inside, my stomach twisted. I could see my father-in-law's judgmental gaze scanning our living room, taking in the extra safety measures, dissecting them with quiet disdain. But a part of me felt triumphant because I felt like I'd done my part to protect my daughter. They greeted Ava with a syrupy sweetness that made me even more uneasy. As the day progressed, my in-laws prattled on about their lives in the city, how much better things were there, and I bit my tongue to hold back a million retorts about the pressures of city living. Their comments turned to parenting advice before long, filled with passive-aggressive suggestions that sent my blood pressure soaring. I steered them away from danger zones. The balcony is off-limits, because of the netting. But they insisted that Ava could handle it. And then I heard it, a soft, yet unmistakable sound from above. The attic. I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Could my daughter have found a way up? I excused myself, my heart racing, and bounded upstairs 2 steps at a time, convinced I'd find her playing among the cobwebs. The attic door creaked open, and I stepped into the dim light, expecting to find calamity awaiting. Instead, I was met only with silence. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the old shoebox, a single beam of light catching on the porcelain dancer. But when I approached, my hand brushed against a pile of items hidden beneath a dust-covered blanket, and I froze. It was personal stuff, my old toys, and also something that wasn't mine, a rusted knife, half buried beside an old doll. I recoiled, backing away, but the moment did send chills through me. Why on earth was a knife up here? Just as I took a breath to regain my composure, a loud crash echoed downstairs. I bolted down the stairs, the whisper of dread trailing behind me. Upon entering the living room, I nearly fainted. Ava sat on the floor amidst the ruins of a table lamp, her wide eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and pure delight. My in-laws were glaring at her, my mother-in-law shielding her mouth in horror as my father-in-law reached for the phone to call someone. I panicked. "It's just a lamp," I practically screamed, gripping Ava as she chimed in cheerfully, obliviously proud of her little escapade. "Look, Mommy, I knocked it over." But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She launched into a tirade about how I needed to control my child, the implications of an uncluttered house cutting deeper than the knife I'd found. I felt my heart racing in my chest, rage bubbling over as I snapped back. "I'm just trying to keep her safe." "Is that a crime?" The air thickened with tension, words spilling out like toxic waste. Ava whimpered as the shouting echoed around her, turning her giggles into tears. My memory of the rusted knife clawed at me, whispering the dangers lurking in the corners of parental responsibility. The in-laws left that day under a cloud of disappointment that carried through the air like a death knell. After they left, I turned to Ava, feeling more defeated than ever. It was just a table lamp, but I could sense too much had been awakened. That night, I found myself back in the attic, drawn to the violated innocence of my childhood treasures. I didn't care that I was scaring myself. I needed to understand why someone would have hidden that knife. As I pulled the doll from the pile, I was unprepared for the sight of something I'd never noticed before, stitched into the fabric, a single word in fading thread: help. The letters blurred together until a memory from so long ago slapped me in the face. It was my mother's warning, a phrase I hadn't thought about since childhood, a nondescript caution about strangers, but I had dismissed it then, just as I had dismissed the weird unease my in-laws always stirred within me. Parental instincts, they say, are born through fear, but I realized my fear ran deeper this time. The knife, the warnings, the porcelain dancer, it all fit into a secret puzzle of silence that I thought had been long forgotten. Suddenly, the mundane act of child-proofing my house felt like a wake-up call to a monstrous reality. I climbed back down, determined but unnerved. Nothing else mattered now. I had to protect Ava. The old fears returned in waves, whispering the awful truth that sometimes, the real dangers come not from our children, but from the shadows we inadvertently bring into our lives. And as I stood guard at Ava's bedroom door that night, listening to her soft breathing, I felt the eerie sensation of being watched, as if the shadows were deliberating, waiting for an opportunity to rise. The next time my in-laws planned a visit, I'd have to make a choice. Would I child-proof against the world, or would I prepare for the secrets that hid behind the look of disappointment on their faces? I didn't know the trouble I was stirring when I casually mentioned the inappropriate comment made by my brother-in-law, so let me start from the beginning. I'll never forget the night we sat in my sister's living room, the warmth of the fireplace filling the space as laughter echoed between us. My boyfriend, James, was making some joke that transformed into a hesitant silence when my Bill walked in, his eyes shifting too quickly away from me. It was a regular family gathering until he leaned towards me, mouth curling into a smirk, and whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "You know, I can make you feel better than your boyfriend ever could." I laughed it off as a crude joke, but deep down, the weight of those words anchored in my chest like a stone. I didn't tell anyone, didn't want to ruin the night, and with a glass of wine in hand, I pretended like it never happened, but that smirk lingered in my mind, a ghost that would haunt me into sleepless nights. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel the tensions rising around the dinner table. My sister noticed that something was off, that I was quieter than usual, and James seemed to pick up on it too, his confusion morphing into concern. One evening, we found ourselves alone on the couch, the softness of the moment washing over me, and it spiraled out before I could catch my breath. I confessed to James what my Bill had said, thinking it would make him angry and protective, but instead, his face drained of color, a mix of disbelief and something more profound flickering in his eyes. "You should tell your sister," he said, and I imagined the tumult it could create. Was I overreacting? I didn't want to be that person who caused drama, who stirred the pot, but the thought of seeing my Bill again, of pretending everything was normal while I carried that secret, felt unbearable. So, after a restless night plagued with guilt, I took a leap. I found my sister in the kitchen, her back turned to me, music softly playing, and I told her the truth, my voice trembling, heart racing, waiting for that inevitable fallout. The recognition that sparked in her eyes was worse than I expected. She crossed her arms, her body rigid, and demanded I didn't play games, that I was out of line for trying to ruin their relationship over something so trivial. My stomach dropped, the betrayal slashed deep, and still, I pressed on, but it felt as though I was drowning in her disbelief. "He would never say that," she yelled, disbelief spilling out like venom, and before I could piece together a defense, my Bill stepped in from the hallway, his smug demeanor reeking of knowing something I didn't. In that moment, I felt trapped. I was the villain for sharing a secret, while he was framed as the innocent bystander, charming, disarming with that smile that had once felt welcoming, now twisted and sinister. More drama erupted like a storm, as James finally snapped, defending me with veracity, calling out my sister's blindness and my Bill's insidious nature. It felt like watching the world unravel, colors bleeding into chaos, accusations flying, and amidst it all, I stood there a fragile vessel of truth as my sister's heart shattered against the reality of her husband's hidden face. Suddenly, the tension escalated, voices booming off the walls, and in the commotion, my Bill attempted to save face, masking his discomfort with arrogance, backpedaling, and making excuses, but every denial fell flat around us, and the room felt as though it was crumbling, like we were standing on shaky ground. The aftermath of that confrontation shattered everything I knew. My sister no longer looked at me the same. Family gatherings were filled with awkwardness, stolen glances, and heavy silences, with my Bill always lurking, never quite able to meet my eyes, a specter of guilt hanging between my sister and me like a suffocating fog. The cold truth gnawed at my gut. I had been right to speak up, yet I felt you could also argue I had been wrong for tearing my sister's life apart. Days turned to weeks, and I began to notice the cracks in their marriage, the late nights, the whispered conversations, and my sister's phone buzzing incessantly, her face paling at every ding. She had started to pull away, and I couldn't tell if what I did was protecting her or sealing her doom. One night, I received a frantic call from James. My Bill was in a car accident, the extent of his injuries unknown, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I thought of how everything had unraveled, how the accusation had peeled away layers of our family, each peeled section exposing scars that were better left hidden. My sister arrived at the hospital, her eyes red, her heart clenching in fear and uncertainty, and I felt a pang of remorse twist in my chest. Despite the pain he caused, seeing her like this made me question everything all over again. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the silence spoke volumes. When they wheeled him in, bruised and battered, the sharp sting of regret was almost unbearable as she rushed to his side, whispering sweet nothings that felt like hollow echoes in the sterile room. I turned away, leaving them to their moment of twisted fate, my heart heavy with the weight of choices made under duress. Watching them reconcile, I felt like a voyeur to a world that now had to navigate treachery disguised as love, and in that waiting room, surrounded by facades of support, I realized the true horror of it all. Was I the villain for sharing a secret that should have never been mine to carry, or was I just a wronged sister bearing the burden of truth in a world filled with dark secrets that fester in silence like a malignancy? As I stepped into the dark of the night, the stars seeming to mock me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror wasn't just what my Bill said, but what love could endure. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. I always thought the engagement ring my grandmother bequeathed to me was just a family heirloom, sparkling with history and nostalgic whispers of love, but ever since her funeral, it transformed into something else entirely, something sinister. When she passed away, my mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at her heart as if it might burst from grief. Amidst the echoes of mourning, I received the delicate ring, an intricate weave of gold, encrusted with a single brilliant diamond that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own under the flickering chapel lights. For days, I kept it hidden in a small velvet pouch in my drawer, overwhelmed by not just the weight of loss, but the sense of obligation that accompanied such a treasured legacy. My mother, however, started dropping hints about how it rightfully belonged to her, how it was part of our family's bloodline, and how I shouldn't keep it for myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the ring was meant for me, and the fiery tug-of-war between familial loyalty and personal desire only intensified when I put it on. I swear I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering to me in the silence of my lonely room, coaxing me to protect it, to honor it. Then, the odd things began to happen. Shadows stretched across my walls, dark fingers creeping along the edges of my vision when I was alone at night, and every time I caught a glance of my reflection while wearing the ring, I felt a stranger staring back at me, but with my grandmother's warm smile creeping into her lips. My mother grew more frantic, restless, even desperate, and I began to piece together a darker story, one where the ring was a vessel for my grandmother's spirit, fiercely protective and unyielding. A week later, in a feverish dream, I found myself sitting at an enormous old table surrounded by flickering candles. My grandmother sat across from me, her smile soothing yet demanding. "This is your responsibility now," she said, her voice echoing off the walls like a forgotten lullaby, and even in the dream realm, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against my chest. I woke up sweating, the ring still settling into the cool, clammy skin of my finger, a reminder that whatever this was, it flowed far deeper than a mere inheritance. It was legacy, it was obligation, it was power. My mother, however, had a darker intention. She wasn't just mourning, she was scheming, obsessively trying to reclaim the ring as if snuffing out my claim would sever some invisible link to our family's history. Anxiety gripped me, twisting my thoughts into frenzied knots. Who did I trust? Weeks dragged on, and I felt the shadow of my grandmother's spirit wrapping tighter around me as whispers morphed into bolder calls for protection. One night, she was more vivid than ever, her voice an intoxicating melody laced with urgency. "It's not safe anymore," she warned, making me question what I'd stumbled into. Paranoid and restless, I began to notice my mother getting darker, her mood shifting inconsistently like a thunderstorm churning in the distance, and the way she looked at me began to shift, from concern to an unsettling intensity that made cold trickles dance down my spine. I told her I would not give back the ring, and the clash between us felt like a rift splitting through the very fabric of our family. It was on that night, amid the hazy air of our argument, that the electrical hum of energy crackled, and the lights flickered as if my grandmother's spirit was the very essence fueling the atmosphere. My mother's voice darkened, exposing a bitter undercurrent intertwined with anger and sorrow, revealing that she believed I was chosen to carry a curse rather than a blessing. A bone-chilling laugh erupted from her throat, twisting my insides into knots, an echo I'd never encountered before. That night, sleep was a distant memory as dread gnawed at my gut, yet finally, exhausted and restless, I slipped into slumber sometime after dawn, prompting my mind to play tricks on me as I entered a world where the walls swirled like shadows. My dreams morphed, becoming grotesque and vivid, filled with whispers like a low hum echoing around a cavernous chamber, the very essence of my grandmother enveloping me, melding past and future. I saw visions of my mother, filled with rage and desperation, lunging for the ring that sat snugly on my finger, and with each harrowing vision, the weight of her fury clawed at my insides. When morning finally arrived, a surge of dread spiraled down my spine, pushing me to confront the reality that lay ahead. I ventured downstairs only to find the house still as a grave, and the air felt thick with an unsettling tension, the remnants of the argument hanging heavy like fog. I reached for the delicate ring only to find it had vanished from my nightstand, and panic gripped me. Where could it be? My heart thudded violently as I trudged through the house, searching high and low until I stumbled into my mother's dimly lit study. In the center of the room stood my mother, clutching the ring with feather-light fingers, a manic glimmer alight in her eyes that sent my heart racing and my defenses rising. "You don't understand, do you?" she hissed, her voice woven with a cunning that chilled my bones. I was taken aback, every part of me screamed to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but the air between us crackled with an energy that felt almost ancient. Within her eyes, I glimpsed something dark, and suddenly the realization hit, and I understood the truth. It was more than just a ring, it was a battleground for our grandmother's spirit, a catalyst seeking to protect what once was, sparring between desire and duty, life and death. But before I could grasp the weight of that revelation, my mother raised her hands, clutching the ring like a talisman, refusing to accept its rightful fate. In that moment, the temperature in the room plunged, and a shadow loomed behind her, clearer than day. It was my grandmother, her face twisted in indignation, furious that we were tearing ourselves apart over something that was supposed to symbolize love. Everything spiraled out of control in that tense standoff, voices growing louder, breaths quickening, and as my mother let out a primal scream, the ring began to tremble as the spectral figure flared to life, her voice deafening, filled with a tidal wave of anguish and fury. "Release it to the one who knows the truth. It was never yours to take," she declared, and just like that, amidst a whirlwind of emotions, the house began to shake violently, glasses shattering while chaos reigned, leaving me standing there, the weight of decision crashing down like a tidal wave, because in that moment, I realized it wasn't about giving back the ring, it was about reclaiming the love it represented and making a choice. So no, I didn't give back the engagement ring. I chose to embrace the echoes of my family's love, to acknowledge what my grandmother whispered through the void, where grief and fear dance hand in hand. And eventually, it became clear, some inheritances are a burden, but they also shine a profound light on who we choose to become amid the chaos, though the shadows still linger, and I wonder if the whispers will ever truly fade. It was a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to New York, and after hours of cramped leg space and the constant hum of the engines, I was relieved to finally feel the plane start its descent. As we touched down, the anticipation of reuniting with friends for a long-awaited trip filled me with excitement, but that joy quickly dimmed when the plane rolled to a stop and the chaotic symphony of kids crying and parents shushing them erupted around me. Just as I unbuckled my seatbelt, a mother in the row ahead of me started shouting at her child, a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, who had transformed himself into a living tornado of rage and defiance. He was poised to unleash a tantrum that could rival any natural disaster, kicking the seat in front of him with relentless fury, and then it happened. The mother, rather than reassuring him, began to scream, and her voice pierced through the dull noise of the cabin like a siren, as if the whole plane had become a stage for their performance. When the seatbelt sign turned off and the doors opened, I stood up eagerly, ready to move forward, when this little monster darted into the aisle, throwing his arms up and screaming as if he believed he could bring down the whole aircraft with just his cries. Corners of people's faces contorted with annoyance as frazzled parents tried to reason with the child while he stomped his feet, flailing like a banshee. In my peripheral vision, I noticed an older man behind me. He looked ready to snap, his patience already worn thin by the chaotic scene unfolding before us. As he shouted at the kid to stop acting like that and to get out of the way, I felt an unfamiliar pull of anger rise within me, an unyielding impulse ignited by worn-out anxieties of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was standing there, frozen in indecision, 1,000 possibilities passing through my mind. Should I step aside? Should I yell too? But then an audacious thought crossed my mind: why should I? It wasn't my child throwing a fit, and why was the rest of the world suffering under this child's tantrum? As the tantrum escalated, I stood my ground stubbornly. The boy began crying harder, his wails echoing through the cabin as he kicked his little feet against the aisles, making it impossible for anyone to get past. I watched as parents attempted to calm him down, but their efforts were futile. The little boy's pleading screams devolved into a cacophony of noise that seemed to seep into my very bones. I finally whispered, "You've got to be kidding me," under my breath, just as the elderly man behind me shoved my shoulder gently, signaling me to move aside, but instead, I clenched my teeth and grit my teeth, unwilling to give an inch. "Move," he exclaimed, hitching his backpack and glaring at the kid as if he could force him to cooperate through sheer will. It was surreal watching two adults struggle against the manic outbursts of a child, and in a fit of anger, I turned around and snapped at the man to back off, that this had nothing to do with me, and I wouldn't be the one to budge. My voice was louder than I intended, and a wave rippled through the crowd like I had unleashed some invisible force that suddenly everyone had felt. It silenced the room momentarily, and the little boy looked at me wide-eyed, screen-printed with confusion. The mother, no longer raising her voice, stood still with a glazed expression, her hands frozen on either side of her son, the heat of shame and frustration radiating off her. I was taken aback, realizing I was now at the center of this whirlwind, a moment where rage intertwined with guilt as my heart raced in my chest. I felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and regret, unsure if I had escalated the situation or somehow brought relief. I had thought I was being resolute, but instead, I found myself entangled in an emotional disaster. The tension in the cabin thickened, and as the seconds stretched into forever, the boy finally broke. He let out one last defiant scream and surprisingly spun around, sprinting back to his seat, still crying as loud as his lungs could manage, while parents finally scooped their children up and started to clear the aisle, moving around me like I was an immovable object in a world of chaos. But then something terrifying happened. As he settled back into his seat, I suddenly felt a rush of nausea sweep over me, an all too familiar feeling that accompanied moments of pure dread, a thought creeping into my mind that mirrored the chaos. I hadn't just deemed that child a nuisance, had I? I was now a villain in this story, solidified in place and surrounded by sympathetic glares from onlookers who had witnessed my outburst. Words flared hot at the tip of my tongue as I turned to the older man, a stranger who I now saw as a comrade in this blender of emotions. "I'm sorry," I stammered, a futile attempt to mend the invisible rift that had formed, but he laughed, a low, gravely laugh, and nodded, almost approvingly. "You didn't deserve that. No one did. You're not their babysitter," he replied, causing me to feel both relieved and more lost than ever. It dawned on me in that moment, this whole shambolic episode of human suffering was not only about the child, it was about me as well, but the more I dissected it in my head, the more I knew my reaction was rooted in my own tumultuous past. What I thought was just an inane airplane encounter was turning into a dissection of my own character weaknesses. I had endured far worse moments long before needing an emotional outlet against the harrowing memories that had seeped into my mind over time, of feeling trapped, of feeling like I couldn't escape my own emotional dysfunction that had caused echoes of laughter and anger to crumble into one another through time. It wasn't just about parenting, it was about trauma. This innocent child had opened a can that I wasn't ready to confront, and suddenly a flash of clarity struck me like lightning. What if I needed to be shaken for a reason? Luckily, as the line began to move, I found myself taking my first tentative step toward the exit, lingering behind the furious mother and her misbehaving child, drifting just far enough back to feel safe yet still close enough to engage in the raw humanity of what had unfolded. I made it to the door just behind them, and when we finally stepped into the cool air of the terminal, I caught a glimpse of the boy, still ensnared in his mother's frustrated grip. Their dynamic struck me as bittersweet, two broken souls meeting at an intersection of despair. At the last moment, I realized that the world isn't simply black and white. Every outburst is a story, every tantrum wrapped in layers of the unexplained, and in that instant, I forgave us all, even myself, for simply being human. With every part of me still unsettled, I merged back into the flow of travelers, carrying the weight of that awkward confrontation, caught in a web of empathy that lingered in the air, a breath away from devastation and understanding, and as I walked through the throng of people, I hesitated for just a moment to turn back, half expecting to catch the boy's eye, but instead, I found only the fleeting silhouettes of silhouettes blending into the crowd of hurried passengers, their lives intersecting through the storm, never to meet again. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strange sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood. In that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I never considered myself an overly dramatic person, but the night I sent that text to Claire felt like something snapped inside me. It wasn't just a day of frustration but the culmination of months watching my supposed best friend slip away into her endless cycle of busy with no space for the people who actually cared about her. The backstory was simple. Claire had always been the life of the party, the friend who could charm anyone into laughing, but as soon as she landed that promotion, everything changed. Texts went unanswered for days, outings were forgotten or rescheduled, and each time I reached out, her excuse felt more like an avalanche burying us further apart rather than a mountain we could climb together. After what seemed like a final straw, I shot her a message that echoed with my resentment. AITA for telling my friend she can get back in touch when she stops being perpetually busy. I put my phone down and immediately regretted my harsh words, yet part of me felt vindicated, a sense that finally, I'd said what I'd been too scared to articulate for so long. Claire's response wasn't immediate. Instead, there was a deafening silence that made me revisit all those memories we had, the laughter, the late-night talks, the promises of sticking together no matter what. Slowly, dread crept in, replaced by guilt, as I started to wonder if I'd really lost her for good. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day my initial fury waned into a dull ache of longing, until one night, I was awoken from a fitful sleep by a sudden vibration from my phone, my heart racing as I saw Claire's name on the screen. But when I opened her message, dread fueled the rush of blood to my face. She was apologizing, but not like I hoped. Claire hinted at her busy life, but there was something heavier, almost ominous in the words. "You don't understand," she wrote, followed by a string of excuses that could have been relatable if not for that unshakable feeling clawing at my mind, a chill that whispered that it was more than just a busy schedule. Ignoring the pull in my gut, I pushed back. I told her to stop the excuses and pushed her for the truth about what had really changed. A bad idea, I guess. I should have let it go, let her come back when she was able to face me again instead of poking through her life like a curious child, because that only escalated the tension between us. In my next message, I asked pointedly, "What does busy really mean for you?" And with that second text sent, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. Her silence morphed into something heavier than I could have anticipated. Suddenly, weeks became a winding path of vague acknowledgments and exchanges tinged with tension until she finally agreed to meet. When we did meet, she looked different, like an entire universe had passed between us. Her eyes were shadowed, cheeks sunken, and her words trembled with a weight I couldn't comprehend. As we sat in the dimly lit cafe, every small talk fell flat. All I could think of was that the light in her had dimmed, almost as if all the joy I knew was trapped somewhere in her busy life. So I desperately grasped for answers, and when I asked her point blank what had really happened, her fingers went still, the air thickened, and her eyes darted around before whispering a confession that sent ice through my veins. "It's not just my job," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not the only one feeling left behind." And when she took a deep breath, I held back tears, bracing for a horror that her words carried, a revelation of how deeply the busy facade had become a shield for something darker. She spoke of a man she didn't know anymore, of late-night calls that turned sinister, and friends whose busy lives were mere distractions from deeper problems, of her struggles and the friends replaced by shadows, until the connection hit harder than a punch. I was losing her, slipping away into a world I couldn't reach. Before I could respond, Claire's face drained of color, and she shot a glance toward the door. Chilled by the sudden urgency in her eyes, I turned just in time to see a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the threshold of the cafe, a silhouette with a familiar air that sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore the rising panic, but Claire's reaction was telling. She jumped to her feet, gripping my arm. "We have to go, now," she urged, and the desperation in her voice sent my heart racing. We bolted out into the streets, and as her shaky hands held the door open, I felt that something was hunting us, a relentless specter lurking in the shadows of our conversations, waiting to pull Claire back into whatever darkness stalked her. We spent the next few hours zigzagging through back alleys, weaving in and out of shops until finally, we collapsed into a cramped diner, both gasping for breath. As we sat there, the weight of unspoken secrets loomed over us like a storm, and while I tried desperately to convince her to share the stories that gnawed at her, the look in her eyes told me more than words could. She was scared, not just of whatever hunted her, but of revealing the truth that had been clawing at her for so long. It was in that moment I realized the gravity of my message. This busy life of hers was more than just a job, it was a barrier, a desperate attempt to keep the shadows at bay. I made a silent promise to myself, a promise to break through the fear that bound her even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. But the night didn't end there, and right as we decided to head out, wrapped in our resolve, there it was again, the distant hum of bad energy, a sense of ice stalking us just out of sight. Our instincts kicked in, fears bubbling to the surface, culminating in an unspoken understanding that, whatever passed between us was not finished. And as we ducked and weaved through the darkness, I felt the familiar weight of haunting echoes, every unanswered message, every ignored call, every vicious cycle. It all came crashing down. Claire had been drowning this entire time, and I had been blind.